Extinction! Extinction!
Farhana Yamin, a climate change lawyer, is arrested after gluing herself to Shell headquarters.
Why didn't I do this a long time ago?
Disruption. That's the key thing.
Joining XR was feeling for the first time like anything was possible.
Section 14 place, no protest allowed.
The government's bill says that those who cause annoyance could be jailed for up to 10 years.
It's expanding police powers, it's politicised protest, it's really a silencing bill.
The relationships outside of your work life are failing.
Realizing the potential that a movement like XR has. Despite its many imperfections, we are in rebellion. Just that is hella powerful.
Let me do very quick introductions. So Farhana, as we all know, is an internationally recognized environmental lawyer and activist. And she's advised leaders and ministers on UN negotiations, climate negotiations for 30 years, representing small island and developing countries, and attending nearly every major summit since '91. She was voted number 2 on the 2020 BBC's Power List, with judges describing her as a powerhouse of climate justice. So that's lovely. Maia Kenworthy is an independent documentary filmmaker. She's directed and produced films for charities and arts organizations, taught creative workshops in schools and universities, and she has a background in history and art. In 2018, she met the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion and has spent the last 4 years immersed in the world of activism. And Sam Fankhauser is the climate change economics and policy professor at the Smith School, and before moving to Oxford, he was director of the Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change and the Environment at LSE. He was the inaugural member of the UK's Climate Change Committee and its Adaptation Subcommittee, and he served as a non-executive director of the CDC Group, which is the UK's development finance institution. Earlier, he was with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and he was deputy chief economist. There, he was deputy chief economist, and he's also been at the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility. So we really couldn't have, a more esteemed panel. I'm going to start, Ashley, with Sam. So Sam, it would be great to have your initial thoughts on the documentary. And I'm curious about your view on this, particularly because you've been on the government side to some extent, right? You've been part of policy making with the UK Climate Change Committee. And it would be wonderful to hear about, from the inside, what the role is and what the influence is of public movements, of protests, of disobedience. How do they influence what happens, even with what we think are apolitical scientific processes?
Okay, do you have an easier question? First of all, I want to start with saying it's a really wonderful film. It's amazing, beautifully well done, both the protagonists and the producers, so huge compliment to you. Why is it a beautiful film? Because it sort of shows the human side of a protest, and it shows the journey everybody is on, and the fact that not everybody is, in a sense, on the same journey. So, yeah, huge congratulations on that. What do I think of Extinction Rebellion? Actually, the other thing I want to say, I'm almost in the film. Not because I'm an XR member, but the scene outside the Royal Court of Justice with the blue boat, that used to be next to my office at the LSE, and I happened to wander around because I was curious to see what's going on there. Luckily, you didn't catch me. What do I think of Extinction Rebellion? I think it's sort of a mixture of, I don't know, the percentages are random, 50% positive, 20% rhetoric, and 30% counterproductive. You can argue the percentages, but let me expand. On the positive side, I used to say on panels like this, you always get asked, what can I do? What's my role in this? And I always used to say, the main thing you can do is create a lot of noise. Go out there, tell what you think, put pressure on political processes, and sort of make politicians listen to you and take action. I don't have to say that anymore because that has happened. And I would, Extinction Rebellion is part of that. I would sort of put the school strikes, David Attenborough, and then Extinction Rebellion in the sort of order of their influence. The reason why I say that is that children have a huge amount of influence over their parents and their grandparents. That's a really, really powerful force for good. And that's a movement that's been really, really good, really beautiful, really changed the debate. David Attenborough, because he sort of appeals to every view from the Guardian reader to the Daily Mail reader. And that's, for me, is part of where the sort of the negative part of Extinction Rebellion comes in. It has energized a big part of the community in a really beautiful way. It has probably made another part of the community switch off. And we can't afford any part of the community to switch off. Everybody, whatever their sort of political orientation, whatever their values is, everybody has to sign up to this. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So we have to find ways of communicating and engaging in a way that brings everybody along. And that's the sort of the bit of Extinction Rebellion where I sometimes feel like maybe that's the potentially counterproductive bit. The rhetoric bit, the three asks that Extinction Rebellion had, I thought they were good, telling the truth, sort of be transparent about the risks we're taking. Absolutely agree with that. I'm not sure everybody always does. There's exaggeration on both sides, but that's an absolutely key demand. The Citizens' Assembly, there was one. That was actually one of the wins that didn't quite come out of the film. That was one of the wins that the Extinction Rebellion had. And that was a wonderful, beautiful, powerful process as well that really changed the UK debate around the six-carbon budget in a good way. Net zero by 2025, that's just unrealistic.
Can I push you on how these are seen from inside policy-making rooms?
I think government completely mishandled the thing. I mean, those scenes with the police and the bill and all that, that's just a sign of a government who doesn't know how to handle protest, and that's, that's not a pretty sight. I think it has, though, again, the combination of Attenborough, Greta, and Extinction Rebellion has shifted the political process in a good way. The net zero target that was passed, actually in the middle of Brexit mayhem, the last thing Theresa May did, plus minus, was pass a net zero target. And that was driven by a sense that, the population is behind that. That's something that people wanted to do. There's a precedent to that, incidentally, the Climate Change Act of 2008. It wasn't the same visible civil society pressure, but there was NGOs played the Climate Change Act very well, and the reason why we have that law was a combination again of grassroots pressure and political reaction to it. So it played a role. Again, I think it made some people switch off, but the net zero target you can take some credit for. The Climate Assembly you can take a lot of credit for.
Thank you, Sam. That's really very helpful, and especially because you've been on the inside. Maia, thank you for making that film. It's wonderful and so thought-provoking, and you captured all of these complexities, which is not easy to do. Could you say a little bit about the challenges of chronicling those inner tensions and just what it meant to be able to do that as the group itself changed over the course of the film?
Yeah, and I mean that's not even half of it.
there was so much to weave together, and we had to make decisions on what stays and what goes, and we were also conscious of it wanting it to be an honest film and a film that could be useful to start conversations, get people thinking, but not a film that would, give too much ammunition to those that want to take down a group like this, because that is a very real thing. I mean, it's happening anyway. We've actually got a new police bill that's even worse than the one that passed last year. Literally just going to a protest, you don't even have to have a criminal record or have been arrested, and you can now end up potentially with a tag, having loads of surveillance, being told you can't meet certain people, you can't use the internet, you basically just can't protest anymore. And that's just going to 2 or more protests in the last 5 years, just being at a protest. And yesterday I was watching footage of someone being arrested for holding a banner on a pavement outside a company that's funding fossil fuels. So it was always a bit of a balancing act of being honest, but not wanting to feed that. And I think the key thing for Elena, who I made the film with, was that I think because we met the group early on and we embedded really early, we really did understand what was happening. We kind of lived it with everyone. And we kind of watched other TV crews come in and film really intensively, but only for a couple of months, and then do a sort of 10-week edit. And, they'd kind of scratched the surface. And we thought, no, we've spent the time with people like Farhana. We do understand a lot of what's going on here. And it kind of felt like, we've got this footage, we've got these stories, and we should get them out there and tell a nuanced, complicated story, because it deserves that. And yeah, we hope that it's a springboard for people, on lots of important issues. So yeah, it was tricky though, yeah. And I still have moments where I think, did we have to have that? Should we have put that in there? Especially the more personal stories, that they were probably the ones that I was the most reticent about, like the father-daughter dynamic. I think my initial instinct had been to keep it as political as possible. But actually then you realise the personal things you weave through that is something that most people can relate to, and that's important to bring in a wider audience, I think. It's not just a film for activists, so.
Yeah. And you were able to capture that. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Oh, no. I think that's what's wonderful about it, that activists at the end of the day are humans, and we're you. Come from all walks of life, and there's a whole set of people who are supporting, or in some cases, at the other end of those impacts. And you saw my family was very, very supportive at that point of my life. They also have been through a lot, and you also saw that. So I think one of the nicest things about this film is, instead of these sort of demonizing accounts of who activists are, you see them as they are, in the flesh and blood, and as part of families with hopes and aspirations and arguments and disagreements. And that was I think really special.
Yeah, and like the personal is political, and vice versa, right? For so many of us. So Farhana, there's this moment in the film where you say Extinction Rebellion works, right? And then the film unfolds differently almost after that. But and then that moment with Heathrow, which I think is very poignant. But if we look at that conceptually, even, it for me just raised this question about at what point, do we start crossing the line of disobedience? And what is too much, and who decides that? And, how does one balance that against the scale of the actual problem that we're dealing with, which is racing at a very, it's racing very fast. And then the opposite end of that, which is when you look at what the state is doing and what the police are doing. And, when the state starts crossing the line, and even what you're saying now about sort of showing up at a protest and, being given a ticket for that in some sense, and start, even instigating violence in some sense. So can you say more about those complexities, right? Which is like when we're part of these processes, in some sense, we're balancing against both, and just how that has unfolded for you as part of this journey.
I think for Extinction Rebellion at that time, I was very clear that as a movement, our members had to decide what risks we were taking and have some sense of the overall, strategy. And we went to extraordinary lengths to then get that strategy agreed, which you see in the film, all those, long hours of meetings with hand gestures and writing. So we went to a lot of extent of creating that buy-in, that everyone was on board on that strategy. And I think, we also canvassed electronically. We sent out a survey to everyone who was registered as an XR activist, what they wanted to do on Heathrow. And the vast majority of people said no, of our own membership said no. And so I felt the movement lacked credibility when it then went ahead with that, because it wasn't democratic, it wasn't showing a new politics, it wasn't showing a new set of values, and you still had, in that case, I'm sorry, you see it there, middle-aged men, white men who decided that, much against the younger activists who they then had to confront. So I feel that was an important turning point and showed a real weakness in our own values and what systems we were going to adhere to, whether we were going to create new governance for ourselves. So that was one thing. And I think for me as a lawyer and as a mother, it was really important that the activists who were being encouraged to take part in that action knew the actual risks they were taking. The gravity of the risks were enormous. Doing an action against national infrastructure is a terrorist offence. It is, up to 20 years imprisonment. It is not a light action of gluing yourself to a door or sitting in a road. It is not a traffic offence. It is not an obstruction offence. It is a major criminal record. So I felt very protective about that. That was internally sure, if someone is an adult, they've been given really clear briefings, they really know what they're doing, maybe that's a case. So I feel like that's where, as a movement, and those of us who are within it were so anti it. And I guess, you saw the scenes where eventually you just get worn out making these arguments, and that it split the movement very early on, those sorts of tactics. And I guess, we started hemorrhaging support, I feel, a little bit too early on because of these battles. I think the police and other actors have to make decisions in a different way. So in the end, Heathrow turned out quite nice. Those teenagers actually then turned up with just a banner and cried and sobbed and actually made
That was the April version.
Yeah,
you don't see that in the film.
Yeah,
there was an earlier one.
Yeah, there was an earlier one. So that was back in April. So sometimes I felt, you'd stopped one car crash from happening and then another one happened another time. I feel like the police have a different standard and a different set of tests, and they're applying those much more harshly. And especially now, as Maia said, we're, the success, frankly, of rebellion, not just by us, but by many other groups as well at that time, the students, the children's strikes, many others. We're in a time when, the real repressive apparatus is being used to now uphold, not just in our country, but I've just come back from Egypt, real petrostates ruled by elites who work with force. And one of the biggest issues in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was, I think in the end, healthy for the climate movement, was the fact that, Egypt has about 60,000 political prisoners. Very few of the NGOs from Egypt could freely attend or speak. Many of the local Egyptian NGOs did come. It wasn't sort of so black and white, but actually they weren't at liberty to criticise the government. They had to be very, very, very careful. And the most famous political prisoner has just been put on medical intervention. He's being force-fed, essentially, Ala al-Fatah. And we can't have, any kind of just or fair or democratic society when we have that kind of abuse. And the climate movement has to learn and work alongside other movements which are also working on political reform, working on a free press, working on anti-police powers, working on migration and migrants' rights, because all of these are forms of injustices and they're all linked. and we can't just tackle one thing, the gases, which is kind of what I thought, I guess, you know, back in 1991 when I set out. You know, we were trying to control the bad gases and use tradable permits and carbon taxes and other fiscal instruments and a bit of education. And frankly, that experiment has failed. That has utterly failed. No one has been able to set up those things in a way that is stringent enough or without loopholes. And now there's huge amounts of greenwashing, up to the point where the UN Secretary General, not XR, the UN Secretary General last year had to set up a task force looking at essentially lies by industry on, you know, claims that they were, greening their act when they're not doing no such thing. There's a whole follow-up of that. So maybe a slightly long answer to the question that you asked, but I think rebellion is absolutely necessary, and the forms of that rebellion are now linked to all of the multiple sort of crises. Our crisis of austerity, not taxing the energy companies, not really confronting the fact that the next COP will be in United Arab Emirates. So the COPs that can host these expensive meetings are immensely rich as a result of fossil fuels, and doing their best to capture a very powerful political machinery of the COP, the Conference of the Parties. And we have, in this country, we're reeling still from the impact of a COVID recession before that, an austerity recession, the banking crisis. We've just got ongoing austerity, and actually there's masses of money all around the world. It's just being appropriated by those who are at the top of the business as usual chain, and fossil fuels lies at the heart of that. So yeah, I feel rebellion. I feel more rebellious watching the end of that film again, and I think actually all of us need to take on that mantle of activism, and not just feel that our ordinary jobs are going to be enough. We know that they're not.
I'm going to open it up, but I do have one follow-up question on that, which is, I did notice when I was watching that I wonder how much it mattered that you became the face in some sense of the movement, right? Because in your role as a climate lawyer, to then make this dramatic switch to becoming an activist and, to being so central to the rebellion, what does that mean about the roles that people need to take about being the faces of these kinds of movements? And would the Extension Rebellion even be what it was without you?
I don't know. I think for me, I don't know.
Or your equivalent, even,
I feel it was very important for them to have basically someone with an impeccable record, someone who had real authority in terms of the green movement. I was a trustee of Greenpeace at the time. I was an advisor to WWF at the time. I was in the UN. So they couldn't level the same kind of charges against me. Oh, there's this hippie, radical. She's always been like this. I was actually always radical, but I chose to put that in a professional context. So I think that became really important, because as the attacks came along, it was it was more difficult to dismiss me along with those others. But we had incredible diverse, set of people, including, grandmothers, those who are from the church, those young people. So I don't feel like it was just on me, but I do feel I played that special role, and I did that knowingly. They needed, a senior credible figure to say law breaking was necessary. And that's basically what I did. And it took, 3 attempts to get arrested. And I never actually was prosecuted legally. I didn't stand, the charges were dropped against me, which I found really annoying, because I feel I have to do that again probably at some point.
We'll talk about the Somerville roots of that activism maybe at the reception. So let's have some questions from the audience. Can I just see a show of hands of how many questions there are? Okay. Let's start here. And maybe we'll take a few. Yeah.
Thank you for the panel and documentary, and everything else. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where Extinction Rebellion is now, because it seems from someone who's not closely involved and follows it day to day, I hear about it less and it's less in the news, and I see people walking down Oxford in red sometimes, but I'm not sure if it's COVID but it seems like such movements have stalled a little bit, and I'm not sure if that is just COVID and those sorts of things, or whether the kind of percentage of the population has been saturated that is aligned. And I'm just curious your thoughts on where the movement is now, particularly when we saw there was a little bit of tension internally, and then where you expect it to go the next year or two.
Can I just see the other hands? Yeah, so maybe at the back there, we'll take 2 or 3 together.
Hi, cheers for that. I'm really interested in, that's my phone, obviously we saw those inattentions, but what lessons did you learn from that, and what would you do differently from an organisational perspective if you had to redo it? That's the question.
Anyone else? Okay, one more here. Sorry, Vanita.
Hi, I found it very interesting what he said about having this kind of respect or this kind of legitimate position in the UN and all these other organizations, but at the same time being rebellious. And do you think it's good to kind of first establish yourself and be a leader in the industry, and then you can step out? Can you do both at the same time, or how would you kind of connect that?
And any of you, all of you, yeah.
Okay, so Extinction Rebellion. I think the exciting thing that happened with Extinction Rebellion sort of after 2019 was that the local groups have just grown and grown and grown. I think there's it's probably nearly 2,000 local groups or something around the world now, and so they're still, strong and going. And the things that they're doing are not necessarily going to cut through to, on a national level, be in the press. But I think having that more sustainable activism, being part of a group that's, has community and is focused on local issues and actually can come together to do national actions, that potential is laid. It's there if you want to call it together. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen in the coming years. There will be, big moments of push again and people, regroup. But I think it's kind of got this amazing network now that's not just UK bound, it's global, and still ticking along. And also lots of activists, I think, from Extinction Rebellion have kind of jumped into other groups. It's not that they've necessarily totally said goodbye to XR, but wherever the energy's gone, they might move to that in that moment. So you'll have seen Just Stop Oil a lot in the news recently, I'm sure. That will be some of the same faces that were in Extinction Rebellion. There's a lot of sort of moving around, and I think people also shouldn't, it's not like, the climate movement is not just XR, right? It's been an important part of it, but it's been around for a lot longer than XR, and new groups continue to form and people move around, and I think that's fine. I think XR also has been quite a good place for people to go who are new to activism, and that's one of the reasons we started filming. Actually, we carried on filming, is meeting people like Farhana, but also nurses and students and architects and builders and all kinds of people coming together who'd never done anything like this before, trying it out, learning about non-violent civil disobedience. I think it's been a really great starting point for people to understand that tool and learn about it.
So two observations on that. One is, I think the power of somebody who isn't a usual suspect doing these things is really very strong. I mean, that clip of you didn't quite make it to the door, but that's a really powerful clip, because you're not somebody whom you'd expect that to do, and that really matters. That sort of catches the attention. So having people who aren't usual suspects is really powerful. I mean, if, Roger had done it, it's sort of, that's what he does for a living, kind of would have been, what else would he do?
Oh, he's a farmer.
True, there's that too. So it needs that sort of, shock moment. And then the other observation I would make is that you kind of have to go beyond the awareness raising and the sort of number of arrests as your KPI at some point, and you have to start solving the problem, and that sort of involves engaging with the institutions, probably joining the institutions, joining them from within, protests only get you so far. At some point you have to kind of make your hands dirty, as it were, join the institutions, change their strategies and change them from within. You can't just protest forever. At some point the work has to start.
I guess just picking up on Sam's question, I feel what would I do differently? I think movement building and creating a positive vision of the future is what I had wanted and many others wanted to spend more time on, not just on the disruption, but on the creativity and the imagination. So I think that never happened because we just kept being in crisis mode, and that suited certain people and also detracted from laying down roots. Where XR is now, it is the most amazing, energizing movement ever, because right now, even in the UK, you cannot document the number of initiatives, the number of groups that came from XR that don't even have the XR label. So very early on, with a group of artists and cultural organizations, they set up, I should say, I just nudged them along, something called Culture Declares Emergency. Then there was Architects Declares Emergency. Then there was Musicians Declares Emergency. These were all groups that now have thousands of members, billions of pounds worth of audience sizes and so forth. We have, lawyers for XR, teachers for XR, nurses for XR, you name it. We've got named groups, unnamed groups, and the energy that came from allowing people to do what they wanted was really, really inspirational. And as I said, I was a trustee of Greenpeace at the time, and it caused so much pain and havoc in that organisation because half those people on the streets were also Greenpeace members who felt frustrated with the existing NGOs who had kind of become quite professionalised and didn't allow their own members to do things. And so when XR came along, it was a do-it-yourself movement, and that creativity from, printing your own clothes, not having to buy a membership, no direct debit being paid, some of the inside ways in which this movement flourished are now, really compelling examples of how we would want to create a better society. So one example, for example, is there was a system called voluntary living expenses, and that's how the core of Extinction Rebellion rebels were supported after we got enough money in, including from a foundation that I worked with that took a big risk. And no one claimed excessive amounts of money. They claimed literally their rent and a bit of food. And that's all they needed. They didn't want any more. It was a real honest system. And at one point, we had 600-700 people. And that was larger than all of the other groups in the UK put together. So it was an extraordinarily powerful force. And now, as I said, the energy has morphed into many things. You've got, as I said, Just Stop Oil making the running. But you also had a lot of groups taking up HS2, the projects. A lot of projects went into that. A lot of activism went into that and into animal rebellion. So there's a huge number of offshoots that are not even called XR. And I think all of them are working their magic. And I think just tying in with your question, rebellion is happening everywhere already, whether it's our students at school who are, you see Rafi, my youngest son, he's now 15. They've all been through this phase and they're not going to forget it. And I think they are absolutely going to use their votes, I hope, for real big changes to come. Hopefully that will be in a couple of years' time. And I think the moment of reckoning is coming, including, I think you will see that in lots of corporations who are greenwashing now, they will find it hard to get, proper good graduates. Actually, that's what happened in many other movements. I think that the mood has changed, so I don't feel it's either or. I did make a bit of I guess I became a lot more professional, but I used to go to demos and marches. That's what we did in the old days. It's just that they didn't change enough things for the better on this issue. They worked very well for other issues. So I think that, do both don't wait. Do both. We don't have time for everyone to wait and fix it through just their legal skills. In my case, I feel I should have become more rebellious earlier.
Okay, Jan, and then there's a question ahead of you.
Sorry, I think the film was wonderful, and I completely applaud activism, and I think activism does bring about huge change, as you've demonstrated, and as we know from history. I should say, of course, that Somerville is incredibly proud to have you, Farhana, as an honorary fellow. Woof, for Somerville. Anyway, Sam, you mentioned that, you know, and I think you're right, but I would say this, wouldn't I, that yes, we've got to have activism. Yes, we've got to protest. And yes, that does bring about change. But actually, laws are made by people in local councils. Laws are made by people in Parliament. Therefore, I personally think it's really important that some people think about that as a trajectory to bring about change. And I just wondered what your views are.
Thank you. I also found that very inspiring. It was a wonderful film. It took me back to the days of CND with the very peace demonstrations, which were part of my generation's upbringing in terms of activism and protest. What I just wanted to remind everybody at the moment is that we've got this lovely upbeat sense that activism is important, activism achieves a lot and so on. But look what's been happening these last week or two in Britain. Look what's been happening this last week or two in Egypt with the COP summit and so on. It looks in many ways as though we're in a very bad place at the moment in terms of all that's happening that we've been talking about. And I'm just wondering if any of you have any suggestions about maybe changing tactics, doing things very differently. And one of the things that strikes me is a bit along the lines of what Jan was just saying, which is it may be instead of these massive demonstrations, we should be concentrating much more on fighting piecemeal changes in different regulations about the oil companies, different regulations about HS2, all the little things which affect the climate change position that we're in and the stance of the government, which at the moment looks so desperately awful. Thank you.
I think there's one question here.
Hi, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I have a question about leadership, because it seems like in the movie, like one of the themes was you had this individual, Roger, I believe was his name, who kind of, you had this huge movement with so many people, and he kind of really brought it downhill, and he was like one man kind of standing in the way of everything that was going on. And I've been in organizations, specifically environmental organizations, where I run into similar problems, where there are people with his similar demographic who like honestly stand in the way, and it's hard to remove. I know eventually they voted to remove him, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about leadership, because Farhana, you're a wonderful leader from what we could see from the film, and you're compassionate and you're empathetic, and you also have all these qualifications. But what do we do when we run into those situations? Like, we're all young here, right? So I could very much empathize with the daughter. So what do you do in that situation when I personally believe you do need to remove people like that from power? But how do you do that? And then when they did have the vote, some people voted to not, or there was one individual who voted to not remove him. So yeah, just a question about that leadership.
Okay, it might be our last round of questions, and then we have a reception afterwards for more.
I feel the top down and the bottom up is really now being woven together as well as horizontally, and that wasn't the case before. So tactically and strategically, that's what I'm interested in. I've devoted a lot of my time now on community action, actually. About a third of my time I spend at the community level, running different pop-ups, different assemblies, trying different forms of governance. I want to make my high street look different. I spend a third of it on creativity and in the creative sector, because in the end we're going to have to imagine a very different world and move towards that. And I spend a third of it on the COPs and those international processes, which are basically, I think, reinventing the architecture of global governance in their own right. And it's, not linear, it's messy, it's complicated, but I really think that is what is happening, and that gives me hope. That might take a year, might take 5 years, might take 50. Most really big changes take a long time. They really, really take a long time. And I feel that, going back to your question, I think that the understanding now is that certain forms of discrimination, certain forms of institutionalized barriers and disenfranchisements came from a whole set of ideas birthed, in institutions like this, when they were inventing PPE, 400 years ago, when women were not seen as people, when black people were seen as slaves, when if you were gay or in some way different, you were ostracized, where if you were disabled, you were seen as irrelevant to society. So now we're at a point where we can value everyone's talents, and that is a massive shift, and that is taking a lot of time. And again, going back to some of the really amazing work that is going on, is about decolonizing ourselves, decolonizing our curriculums to make the pathway to recognizing leadership, different. And one of the nicest quotes, I just did an online assembly, which is really, from the ideas that XR also made popular. An assembly is basically a deliberation based on expert inputs where someone decides something on a question or a direction. And one of the participants, who's neurodivergent, an 18-year-old, said, I want to have communications as diverse as we all are. And I think that's the key. I feel that's the key to understanding leadership styles. Choices must be as diverse as the people who are in this room. And we're getting closer to that, and that's not easy. It's not easy. I was distrusted in XR for a lot of reasons, precisely because I was well educated, I was strong, I came from a liberal, background in the UN. That's precisely the kind of background that some of those, people who are more street savvy and wise distrusted. They distrusted me. So I feel like that those were some of the barriers, and others were, frankly, to do with hidden forms of a subconscious bias and racism. And there were a lot of black and brown people in XR who played huge leadership roles. So it is not the case that it was a predominantly white movement. It was actually, there was a few individuals who, slightly had excess power and charisma and then chose to go their own way. And I still respect, just a final, I really respect Roger. He's in prison right now. He's on remand. So many of the people that you saw are standing trial, those women who broke the windows of Barclays. Many other trials are going to happen. Hundreds of individuals have got criminal records as a result. I really salute them. I really salute and support them for all their warts, for all their disagreements. In the end, they've made a massive difference and paid a really big price. So I do want to sort of say that, because it's sort of hard for me to watch also the film and the disagreements and the arguments. But at the end of the day, there is something really, really amazing about standing up, and especially at this time when we are losing the very fundamentals of, rights that we've won over the last 400 years. I mean, we won those rights, slowly, for women, for black people, for migrants, for refugees, and to lose them overnight almost, it feels really brutal. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to my fellow rebels and be kind to them.
Should we go back to the questions?
Yeah, one in response to what Jan said. I think we have won, or we're very close to winning the fight for attention. I started almost as long as Farhana, my career in climate change, where you had to explain to people what climate change was, and it wasn't changing the investment climate. It was about the environment. We no longer have to do that. There's plenty of information about climate change, lots of reminders in the press, in the media. So we're winning that fight. That we no longer need more attention. What we need to win now is the fight for action. We now have to move on from the attention, from the targets to the action. I mean, the emergency declarations, that was a beautiful sort of symbol, if you will, of intent. But 3 years later, there isn't a sense of an emergency. We haven't sort of followed up the declaration with the action, and that's where we have to go. And that's sort of a combination of lots of different things, a lot of them unglamorous. I talked to a colleague earlier today who wants to change accounting rules. I can't think of anything more boring than that. But it can change behavior in a big way, because there's a whole machinery of how companies report that will be affected by that. It will be in the communities. There'll be a lot about that, and it will be about laws, and it will be about regulation. So it's about a lot of different things, most of them not half as exciting as your film.
Can I ask you to close?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, lots of thoughts, but I guess the main thing that comes up from me from what we've been talking about is that I think we need to keep working together and finding ways to step out of our comfort zones and not just, stay in your lane. And I think that was what was exciting about Extinction Rebellion. You know, yes, there were leadership issues, and some of the co-founders and their energy became quite hard to hold and overshadowed others. But also you needed that initiator energy. You needed people coming in with ideas like Roger's. He really mobilized a lot of people. He went out there around the UK, got a lot of people to get involved. And then you need people like Farhana who come in and have that political experience, that understanding, who, when the civil disobedience is taking off, they can then pick up the phone, get things going so that something tangible comes of it. Politically, you know, having those different people working together is just so exciting and so important. So I think, yes, we need inside, we need outside, but we also need those bridges. So I think, the more we can come together and do that, the better.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We're going to have a reception where our panel will be there. Yeah. And so let's just continue talking. I have lots more questions that I thought I would ask you, but we couldn't get to it. So if you can join me in thanking our wonderful panel, and thank you for making this film.